Colonial North America consisted of a time of change, growth, and establishment. There were broad varieties of ethnic groups and settlers that came through during this time frame. With development and progression swarming all around, population and immigration became huge aspects of growth. Population growth was of course entitled to the idea of natural increase, but also had other reasoning, such as ethnic diversity, the increase in importance of the cities, the creation of the urban elite, rising levels of consumption, and the growth of a stronger internal economy. Colonial population grew from 250,000 to 2.5 million. There was also several thousand immigrants that came to America from places other than England, which demonstrated the lack of allegiance to the crown. Indentured servants made up 3/4 of the immigration population in the Chesapeake region in the 1600s, and with the increased population of Europeans and Africans, the natives were outnumbered. These indentured servants would work for their master for a certain period of time in order to receive what they needed, such as food, shelter, and sometimes land. The influx of people created vast numbers in population growth as well as immigration. The transatlantic trading network was created during this time frame, which included slaves and goods that were carried between Africa, England, Europe, the West Indies, and the colonies in the Americas. It was the backbone of New England's economy during this time frame. The course it took followed in the events of this. Ships from New England sailed to Africa, exchanging New England rum for slaves. The slaves were shipped to the Caribbean, which was the Middle Passage. In the Caribbean, the slaves were traded for sugar and molasses. Then the ships returned to New England, where the molasses was used to make rum. The Middle Passage, as mentioned just a second ago, was a long journey that slaves from Africa had to take to the Americas. When many of them were crammed together and chained in the bows of slave ships and supplied with little food and water, many of these slaves died on the ships due to these conditions. The colonial cities were seen as huge centers where British goods kept coming to America. Trade kept increasing by over 300% in the 3 decades before the Revolution. Mercantilism was an economic policy where nations sought to increase their wealth and power by selling more goods than they actually bought. This became prominent and stated that the colonies should benefit the mother country. Trade became increasingly important and necessary. Immigration was a main aspect during this time frame. There was talk of restricting immigration by the Quakers, but this idea did not go over too well. William Penn was in the process of his holy experiment, and this plan did not go through. Penn was an English Quaker, and he founded Pennsylvania in 1682, after receiving a charter from King Charles II the year before. He launched the colony as a holy experiment based on religious tolerance. Even though Penn didn't want this to happen, the Quakers decided to go about this issue in a different manner by wanting the borderers to settle in the back parts of the colony. This became known as the back country. The back country region included southwestern Pennsylvania, the western parts of Maryland, and Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. It was a huge area that kept extending with more and more settlers. It had ridges and valleys, area going from the coastal plain to the Appalachians, and then area into the western rivers. Scotch-Irish and German immigrants came by the thousands, going to the Appalachians and all over the place. They basically became the pioneers of the colonial period. With this vast horizon of people, ethnic groups and society overall began to increase even more. These plantation economies were very dependent on supply and demand. If the crops were out of demand, then so was the owner's business. Plantations were normally small and outside of the cities. With the production of crops, of course hard work was necessary and needed, therefore slaves started to become imported. The Stoner Rebellion occurred in 1739. This slave revolt included 100 slaves that revolted and seized weapons and ended up killing a few whites. This rebellion was ended very quickly and most of these rebels were killed. Even though this revolt may have been small, it presented an opposition to the norm. Slave codes were passed by colonial assemblies in the early 1700s, reinforcing white superiority and placing limitations on slave rights. Within the slavery world, the owner tried to create an independent economy because the main focus was all on productivity. Whatever it took for productivity advancement was the main goal. The time frame centered on the idea of enlightenment as well. The colonial elite arose establishing a belief in society's ability to to understand the universe they live in through natural laws. One of the main Enlightenment thinkers was John Locke. He strongly believed that people had natural rights to life, liberty, and property. It was encouragement to use reason and scientific knowledge rather than faith and religion to gain knowledge. Colonial North America did consist of a religious foundation behind many establishments, though. One of the major events that occurred was the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening is just what it sounds like, but in more literal terms it is known as a religious revival that was held by Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. This was the first religious revival in America, and it began because Puritans in New England were alarmed at the decline in faith. This revival did the opposite of enlightenment. It encouraged people to renew their relationship with God and to leave their past behind in the process. In the meantime, government policy was focused on salutary neglect. Salutary neglect was a colonial policy that was basically relaxed supervision of internal colonial affairs, and it contributed significantly to the rise of American self-government. Colonists pretty much governed themselves and were independent from British authority. The government was very lackadaisical in their stance towards the people. With the elite leading at first, politics reached a sense of stability. John Peter Zenger was a man that tried going against the government's actions but was found not guilty in pursuit of freedom of speech and press. Colonies became accustomed to their own way of living. Imperial policy saw many benefits such as trade, commerce, military protection, and political stability. With slow progress, colonial North America was on its way to success as well as failure, both equaling into prosperity in the end.